Here we are going to talk about the URL. So the full name for the URL is the Uniform Resource Locator. So URL is actually a subset of URI, the Uniform Resource Identifier. So basically URI contains URL and also the URN, so Uniform Resource Name. So basically, sometimes you will see there's a specific name, and in the format of using semicolon to link it together, then that's usually what we call the URN. And the URL is what you know. It's kind of like the web address that we are using, on the web browsers. So basically, the URL specify where the identified resources is on the internet, and so basically, usually we will call it like the web address. Basically, the URI, Uniform Resource Identifier, is used to uniquely identify a certain resource, and doesn't matter it's on the web or you can say it's in a certain database. But however, if you treat the whole web as a database, the URL is kind of like the ID for those resources on the internet or on the web. So here is the basic syntax of a URL. So basically, it's separated into different parts, as you can see over here. So the first part is the protocol, and it's usually after specifying the protocol, then you will follow by the semicolon and the two slashes over here. So the protocol can be the HTTP or HTTPS or FTP or etc. So that protocol name will be put over here as the first part. And followed by the protocol, the next part is domain, which is this part, domain or the domain name or the IP address. So basically, this part indicates the destination location of the URL, or you can kind of think about the domain name and IP address as the one of the certain web server on the internet or on the web. So by using the domain name and IP address, then you are able to identify that specific machine. So, for example, the domain name, like the Google Map, actually it has a corresponding IP address, which is this one. So originally, people use the IP address to identify the specific machine on the internet. But however, this series of numbers are not so easy to be memorized by a human being. So in this case, there's a more friendly mechanism was proposed, which is what we call the domain name. So, for example, for this IP address, people can use google.com, and instead, so you don't need to remember this IP address of Google. Instead, you can just remember the google.com, and the domain name service. There's some components on the web which is called the domain name service, and that domain name service will help you to translate this domain name to its corresponding IP address. Okay, and then the next part is the port. So as you can see, after the IP address or the domain name, after the semicolon, then you will have the port. So port is actually a series of number. So the default port for the HTTP is using 80 as the port, and for the HTTPS is using the 443. And there are other ports that are available and are usually used by different software or application on your machine. To imagine what the port is, you can kind of think about the domain and also the port relationship as in this way. So, for example, like I said, the domain name and IP address is trying to identify a certain web server on the internet. Then after you identify that machine, and that machine actually can open different ports. Right? That machine can open different ports for different application, and so it's kind of like you have a building, and the entry for that building, it can have multiple entries, and different entry can have a specific number, and that number is kind of like a port over here. Okay, so that means when you access to a certain IP address, and then you can specify different ports, then that means you are using different services provided on that server. And after the ports, and then the next part is usually after the having the slash, and the slash, and then followed by a resource path. And this resource path indicates the location, the dictionary or file name of a certain resource on that server, and also on that like service application. So it's kind of like I said, the domain name and IP address leads you to a certain web server, and that web server have different entry, and then you use the port to specify a certain entry, and in that entry, there are multiple resources can be retrieved, and then you can use the path to retrieve to specify the specific resource that you want. So that's the purpose of the path. For example, if you want, you can put the HTML page over here, and the resource path will indicate which HTML page that you want to retrieve. And then after the resource path, as you can see, the next part is the question mark. So you can put a question mark over here, and after the question mark is the query stream. Is what we call the query stream, and the query stream is actually a way to pass parameters to a server. So usually when you are sending the HTTP GET request, there's no information to be like embedded in the message body. So the HTTP GET request is only using the certain URL and then send that URL to the service. And when you are doing that, sometimes you need to transmit some information from the client side to the server side. And in that case, the query stream is where you can do that. So basically, like I said, it serves as a way to pass parameters to servers. And usually, the query stream is specified in the key value pairs format. So for example, key 1 equals to value 1, and so notice that if you have multiple key value pairs, then you need the and sign over here, and key 2 equals to value 2, and key 3 equals to value 3. So basically, you can have like a lot of key value pairs, and that specify different parameters and different values that you want to forward to the server. So for example, like you can say, I want to transmit the user ID. So maybe you can have the UID or user ID as the key, and equals to the value, which is your user ID. And maybe you want to specify some certain query, then maybe I want to find some a certain data between in the certain time period. So maybe the key 2 can be the start time, and equals to a certain time point, and the key 3 could be the end time. So end time equals to a certain time point. So you can use this type of format to transmit information from the client side to the server side. So that's the purpose for the query stream. And finally, sometimes on a certain web resource, then you will see that people use a hash symbol over here, like the hash symbol over here, and whatever content after the hash is the fragment ID. So, or you can say the fragment identifier. So, the fragment means that it's a certain, we can say, mechanism to identify a part within the resource, a part of document within the resource. Usually, it's used to indicate a certain section in a HTML page. So sometimes you will face you can say I believe some of you have the experience that on a certain web page when you click on a button and then the web browser will automatically score the web page to the corresponding session. And that's then how does it actually work? Actually, it was using the fragments to do that. So you can put the certain URL with the fragment ID for that session. Then when you click on that link, then automatically your browser will know you want what user want to move to that session. So it's used in combination with the ID attribute of an HTML element. So if you want, you can specify the ID attribute on the HTML element and use a hyperlink use a hyperlink with the hash symbol and also the fragment ID. And after you click on that hyperlink, then supposedly your web page will automatically scroll to the session of that HTML element. So that's the basic syntax of the URL, and what I'm trying to encourage you guys is that right now when you go online and you can try to take a look at the web pages that you are currently browsing, and then try to identify which part is the protocol, which part is the domain and IP address, which part is the port, which part is the path, and what is the query string that they are using, and if you are using any fragment ID. So, and the other thing, probably I didn't really like mention it clearly, which is about the port. So so when you are browsing the web, usually you will notice that there is no port specified on the web address. But however, like I mentioned earlier, the default port for the HTTP is the port 80. So in that case, if because the HTTP GET is usually used, and then HTTP is commonly used, so it's too popular that most of the web browser allow you to skip specifying the port, and automatically, if there is no port provided, then they will assume that this is by using the default port 80. So well, it's kind of like becoming the common understanding. So even without the port, then that indicates you are currently using the port 80. Okay, so that's the basic syntax of an URL. So and later on, we are going to move on to the next standard that enables the web, which is the HTML.